guys, welcome back to my channel. Today we're going to continue talking about how you can learn how to cook without a recipe. So if you are new here and you have missed the introductory video, make sure you go watch that and then come back here and learn how I'm about to get this bread. But if the bread is all you're interested in, feel free just to hang out, but make sure you let me know what you think in the comments. Now I know what you might be thinking. Claire, we've just started on the very first meat and potatoes video of this series. Isn't bread a little bit difficult? Shouldn't we start out with something easier like meat and potatoes? Well, no, we shouldn't. People all over the world eat more bread than they eat anything else, and you probably do too if you're able to kind of broaden what your definition of bread is. But I digress. We'll talk about that more later. The thing is, bread isn't hard unless you're trying to make a dense, crusty loaf, in which case you do you. Let's talk about basic things that are required to make most types of conventional, successful bread dough. I'll give you a hint. It doesn't include banana and it doesn't include raisins. If your bread contains that, then it is probably more of a cake. But we will talk more about that in a future video. There are only 3 truly canonical ingredients in bread. They are flour, regardless of the grain of origin, some type of liquid, and a leavening agent. Any ingredients that you see in a bread recipe outside of these 3 categories is completely optional. And it's important to remember that while you do have to have at least one representative from each of these categories in order to have bread, these can all be substituted for lots of different things within that category, and those combinations will allow you to make lots of different types of bread. So let's talk about what fits into each of the flour, liquid, and leavening categories. The first category, flour, may seem like an obvious one, but more and more now we're seeing people move away from things like conventional wheat flour in favor of things like potato, rice, almond, and buckwheat flour, just to name a few. In my own kitchen, without preparation for this video, I have 3 different types of flour. I have conventional wheat flour, I have dark rye flour, and I have maseca or corn flour. These are for tamales. Regardless of whether you're planning on using wheat flour or not, the name of the game is gluten. Gluten is the protein found in wheat flour that helps the bread rise, among other things. It helps the bread to get sticky when wet, and it helps it to stay strong enough to hold together even while all the gas and air is trapped inside the bread dough during the baking process. Especially if you're not using wheat flour, you need to be conscious of how glutinous your flour or flour mixture is going to be, because that is going to directly correlate to the density, texture, and final palatability of your bread. It's also really important to note that even within wheat flour varieties, there can be a pretty significant variance in how much gluten is in each bag of flour, so you've got to read your labels. Specifically branded bread flour, such as this, typically contains between 12 and 14% gluten, while cake flour typically has less than 10% gluten in it. And all-purpose wheat flour, or white flour, which most of us have on hand, can vary wildly in the content of gluten that it has, but any of this will typically still work to make bread. The next thing we need to talk about is what liquid you're going to use to make your bread. Most commonly, it's going to be water, but you can also use things like milk, buttermilk, broth, whey from making cheese, and a whole lot of other stuff. Different types of liquid are going to behave differently in your bread dough, and that's going to also depend on what type of flour you're using and what type of leavening agent that you're using. You should also note that depending on what type of liquid you use, it can also impact the taste of your bread, such as when you use buttermilk or broth. It doesn't have to be a bad thing, but you do need to be conscious of it when you're making your selection. finally, we have come to leavening agents, and this is what causes your bread dough to rise. It may surprise you to learn that leavening agents can be wet, dry, or a combination of wet and dry. Some of the most common forms of leavening agents are active dry yeast, baking powder, the mixture of baking soda and an acid, and starter. Starter is the fermented mixture of flour and water, where wild yeast cultures are cultivated with the idea of leavening in mind. We most commonly think about starter in terms of sourdough bread, but it can be used in a wide variety of baked goods. As with instant or dry yeast, the yeast that is in the starter mixture will feed on the sugars in the dough, and they will release gas as a byproduct. This will get trapped within the dough by that sweet, sweet gluten, and the bread will rise as a result. Many people will add sugary sweeteners to their dough, such as cane sugar or honey, to help with the proofing process, but this is not actually necessary. Speaking of unnecessary additives, people love putting stuff in bread, from cinnamon to cocoa powder, fruits and vegetables, beans, meat sometimes, and for the most part, it's pretty good. It's just unnecessary. Some of the most commonly added things, which are things that I often add myself, include salt, sugar, and some kind of fat. Fat is a whole nother story though, because I personally believe that some type of fat, whether it's butter, olive oil, baking grease, whatever you got, it needs to be present in your bread dough. Even though it's not canonical, I think you need it. It's gonna help your bread stay moist longer and last in a better quality for a lot longer time, but it's also gonna help develop the gluten better, which is gonna result in smaller air bubbles within your loaf or your rolls or whatever you got, and it's gonna result in a better crumb and a better texture for your final product. All right, now that I've talked this thing to death, I'm finally gonna show you how I make my bread. So the first thing that I do is I establish what type of leavening agent I'm gonna use. I've started moving more toward using starter, but for the sake of explanation today, I'm gonna use 1 packet of active dry yeast. If you were using the well of yeast like I showed earlier, that'd be about 2 tablespoons or so, but I'm just gonna pour it directly into my little cup here. And then I add about as much sugar as I have yeast, not a ton. And then I'm gonna add some salt to taste. I usually add a little more salt. I don't know how much that is. I don't know, maybe like a teaspoon, maybe a little less, I don't know. I add a little more salt than you might normally think too, because undersalted bread is so sad. And then I'm going to proof my yeast. Now this is not explicitly necessary, but if you have a dead batch of dry yeast, this is what's going to tell you that it's dead before you mix it into your dough and it doesn't rise and you waste all those ingredients. So to do this, I'm going to add some water to it. You can do it with room temperature water, but it does take longer, so I do it about body temperature or so, kind of like you're making a baby bottle. You want to make sure that you do not use hot water or you will end up killing your yeast. So with that proofing, I'm going to go ahead and set it to the side, and then I'm going to go ahead and start mixing my flour. I usually just use whatever type of flour that I have on hand. It is almost always wheat flour. Today I have actual bread flour, and when I'm able to, I try to buy King Arthur brand because I'll get the unbleached, unbromated stuff from them. And you can do your research on why that would be important to somebody. So I've started out just by pouring some flour into my bowl. I know by now how much I need in order to make what I want, but honestly being able to eyeball it is going to take some trial and error on your part. I recommend when you're getting started that you use the same bowl consistently so you can kind of fake measure and get used to how much you're going to need of everything. So to my bowl, I'm going to add some type of fat. I usually use olive oil like I am today, but I've also used butter and lard, coconut oil, bacon grease, and I get similar results out of each of those. So I just make a little well in the middle of my bowl, and again, I just start pouring the oil in, and then I'll incorporate it with my hands. I know about how much oil I need to add, but it's really all about the texture. So start small, add in only about half of the oil that you think you'll need at first until you get to where you're able to eyeball it on your own. If you're not sure if you have enough oil in your flour, there's a quick little test that you can do. Incorporate the oil completely and then take a little bit of it into your palm and squeeze it. And when you let go, if it holds its shape like this, then you have enough oil. But if it mostly falls apart and it doesn't hold its shape, add just a little bit more oil and repeat this test until your oily flour can hold its own. Okay, we're gonna take a break from the oily flour for a minute, and we're gonna turn our attention back to our leavening water. So what you're looking for is whether or not you see a difference from when you first mixed your ingredients together. It doesn't have to be a big difference. This is not a huge difference, but there does need to be some change in it. See, we do have kind of this head here, like you see when somebody pours a beer, and that means that the yeast is alive and active. If there is no change, if it hasn't done anything since you mixed it together, you may need to try again with new yeast. You can give it another few minutes, but sometimes, especially if your yeast is old, it just won't bloom, and you'll need to consider another leavening agent, such as baking powder, or, like I said, getting new yeast. If your yeast has bloomed, like mine has, we're gonna add it to the oil and flour mixture. I mix this by hand. There are very nice mixers that have a dough hook that you can use, but you need to be very careful not to overmix your dough and overdevelop the gluten in that. So, since it's nearly impossible to overmix your dough by hand, and since I don't own a mixer in the first place, I will be smushing mine together the old-fashioned way. So in all honesty, it is really difficult to convey dough texture over a video. I know that because I've tried to learn dough texture from other YouTube videos just like this one, but I'm gonna do my best. So you're gonna start by mixing together all of your oily flour and your leavening liquid, and once that is completely incorporated with no dry spots on the bottom of the bowl and no overly wet or dry spots on your hands or on the edges of the bowl, once everything is all the same consistency, look at it, and what do you have? Is it very sticky and tacky? Is it very dense and dry looking? Have you made soup? I can't see what you're working with if you are making this at home, but I believe that you can use this information to make an educated decision about what to do next. Very sticky, tacky dough, which does not release well from your hands or the bowl, and which does not form into a ball, is too wet. So you're going to want to add more flour in small increments and make sure that you incorporate the new flour completely before you start adding more. Dough which is very stiff, dusty looking, and doesn't stick to anything, and it couldn't possibly be formed into a ball, is too dry. So please give it some more water. It looks parched. Okay, so we have addressed the Papa Bear and the Mama Bear type situation, so now we have to talk about that just right Baby Bear situation, right? Well, not really. The final texture that you're gonna want out of your bread dough is gonna depend entirely on what you're trying to get out of it. This is my general all-purpose bread dough. I use it for sandwich loaves, for a pizza crust, dinner rolls, cinnamon rolls, pie crusts, and even dumplings or noodles if I leave out the leavening agent. But that's literally the point of this video. Once you get the basics down and you understand the mechanics of the individual categorical ingredients of bread, you can do anything without a recipe, right? I'll see if I can help you out here. Bear with me. As a general rule, you want the final texture of your dough to be a little bit more on the soft and sticky side when you're cooking things that should be very light and airy, such as dinner rolls, cinnamon rolls, and certain types of pizza crust. The opposite is true when you need your bread to stand up for itself against things like a PB&J or pie filling. Now, I don't want to say that the dough should be dry, but you're definitely going to want a more firm dough for things like sandwich loaves, pie crusts, certain types of pizza crusts, and noodles or dumplings, if you've left out the leavening. Once you have decided on your texture and you're happy with it, cover your bowl with a damp kitchen towel for the first proof. Leave the bowl in a warm area to rise for about 20 to 30 minutes if you're using rapid rise yeast, or for like 45 minutes to an hour if you're using standard yeast. If you're not sure what type of yeast you're using, just keep an eye on it, starting around the 30-minute mark to see if the dough has doubled in size. If you try to proof your bread in an area that is cold, it's still gonna rise, but it's gonna take a lot longer. In fact, I know of several people who mix all of this together at night and put it in their refrigerator so they can finish their bread first thing in the morning without having to get all this out. If you do that, make sure that you allow your dough to proof in an airtight container rather than with the kitchen towel method so that it doesn't dry out in the refrigerator. And make sure there's plenty of room in the container for the dough to grow. Anyway, I am planning on cooking this today, so I'm going to let it proof on my counter. The warmer it is, the faster the dough is going to rise. So I'm going to expedite this process by using this microwavable heating pad. You don't want this to be hot, just warm to the touch. If there's a big temperature difference between the top and the bottom of the bowl, it's going to cause the dough to rise really unevenly. So I'm just going to sit this on the bottom and sit my bowl on top, and we're going to wait. So after your bread has doubled in size, you're going to take it out and you're going to turn it onto a lightly floured surface. This is the fun part because we get to knead the dough, and you're really going to get a sense of how dense your dough is going to be. Obviously, the more dense the dough that you have, the more difficult the kneading process is going to be. But it's really important that you keep going even if your arms get a little bit tired, because you really want to redistribute all of those wonderful little gas bubbles that we had during our first rise. Once you have kneaded your dough for a few minutes, it's soft, it's compact, you're going to put it into its final form before you bake it. If you're making a sandwich loaf, you're going to form your loaf and make it to whatever size pan that you have. You're going to grease your pan and you're going to place your dough inside it, and it's going to rise for a second time. Today I am making dinner rolls, and so I have made this into roughly a mock-up of what my pan looks like, and I'm actually going to cut it into the size pieces that I want for my rolls before I form them into little rolls and put them into my greased baking dish. I make really no-fuss dinner rolls. I do a little bit of light kneading. I take a piece from the edge and I put it back toward the middle, but you can look up a lot of different ways to fold the dough for your dinner rolls, some of which will result in a crease so that when you go to like open it and butter it, there's a crease already there. That's all fine, but I'm not doing that for mine. I never have. So I'm just gonna get these set, and once they are all done, we are going to cover them with our damp towel again and sit them on our heating pad again and let them double in size one more time before I put them in the oven. I have formed all of my rolls. They're in my greased baking dish, and I'm going to let them rise the second time. It's really important that you let them rise a second time because we've just redistributed all those air bubbles and we've knocked a lot of the gas out. So they're going to be really dense if we were to put them into the oven and bake them like this. So we want to make sure that they're really big and fluffy when we do go to bake them, because that is how they're going to be whenever they come out of the oven. So we're done proofing for the second time. You can see that my rolls have really filled out the pan. So I'm going to go ahead and put it in the oven. It has been preheated to 300 degrees. I've played around with temperature a little bit, and I think that 300 is the best for my liking when I'm baking bread. The lower temperature allows the middle of the bread to get cooked all the way through, and you don't end up with doughy centers and really hard, crusty outsides. So I'm going to go ahead and put this in about halfway through baking. I'm going to turn it 180 degrees so that it gets browned all the way over, because I don't have a convection oven. And then I'll talk to you a little bit more about how I know that it's done a little bit further into the baking process. Alright, we're in the home stretch, but how do I know when my bread's done? Well, there's not really a set answer for that. It's going to depend a lot on what you're making out of your bread and how much other stuff is in the oven with it, how much you've opened the door, and what temperature you have it set on, that kind of thing. As a general rule, after about 30 or so minutes, you're going to smell the bread baking. It'll be more than a yeast smell, and it'll be more of a fresh homemade bread smell. By this point, it's not totally done yet, usually. It's still going to be kind of doughy in the middle, but the outside's going to look done. What I recommend that you do is turn the oven off and leave the door shut and let the bread cool down inside the oven for about 30 or so minutes. It's going to allow the inside to finish cooking, and it's going to quit cooking the outside so much. It's also going to trap moisture inside the bread, and it's still going to be wonderful and steamy whenever you go to pull it out, but it'll help it cook all the way through and be really nice and perfect. Alright guys, I really hope that you have learned a little something about making bread today, and I hope that I've encouraged you to venture out more without a recipe. If you don't mind, please give this video a like so that YouTube knows that it is good and interesting content, and the algorithm will be able to share it with more people who might find value in this video and in this series. Next week we are going to talk about fruits and vegetables, cooking them and particularly seasoning them without a recipe. I hope you're as excited about that as I am. If you are, then make sure you subscribe and turn on the notifications so that you don't miss a thing. And as always, I want to thank you so much for watching. I'll see you around. Bye.